Three sounds of the, we'll start with three sounds of the bell. So you can come back to our body. Just be aware. It's a wonder to be aware of our body, our breathing. And relax. We don't have anywhere to go and nothing to do. Yeah, dear respected Thai, dear friends, those of us here in the hall and those online, the brothers and sisters are so happy. We have so many friends joining us for the Rains Retreat. This is really where we gather all of our energy as a collective sangha, and if we are skillful and open, we can benefit a lot from the energy of the sangha body. I personally consider it to be my favorite time of the year, because I know no matter who asks me to go out to do this or that, I can always say, nope, I'm locked into the monastery for 3 months. And it's not just a form, but it's making a deep aspiration to wake up, to say that, okay, I'm going to stay here. I'm not going to let my mind just grab after this or grab after that. Sometimes we talk about monkey mind, like the monkey in the mango tree, and while it's eating one mango, it's already grabbing for another mango. It looks a little bit more sweet. But in the Plum village tradition, we use the image of a frog on a plate. So there's a Vietnamese saying that Thai like to say, which is that when you put a frog on the plate, it will jump off. And when you put it back on the plate, it will jump off again. And so he said the first thing we need to attain in the Plum village tradition is froglessness. We go around in our lives looking for pleasurable feelings, a good situation, good vibes, right, or whatever. Yeah. And then when things get a little bit difficult, for example, when our suffering manifests, and then we start to look at the world with different eyes. And those conditions that we thought to be so joyful and pleasant and happy suddenly look, with the lens of our suffering, suddenly look painful and difficult. And so our tendency is to want to run away, to go somewhere else where we won't experience that. And so by kind of locking ourselves in, qua tu in Vietnamese, qua is like the lock. You lock yourself in to tu. Tu is to practice. And it's in the spirit of some of the old Zen temples where even if somebody died in the middle of the sitting meditation, we continue to practice sitting. So it means, that spirit of not letting our suffering drive us away, right? Because when suffering comes up, it's this opportunity to look deeply, to bring the light of mindfulness to that suffering. But because we have the habit of blaming things outside of ourselves for suffering, we think, well, if we just run away to a different place, that somehow we'll suffer less. And even though we remove the immediate stimulus of our mental formation, right? Maybe a word that somebody said, or a look, or an action, but we haven't removed most of the conditions which are right here in our gut, in our mind, in our body. So wherever you go, there you are. You bring your suffering, your unhappiness with you, and in that new situation, you and some of us who are more, have lived life a little bit more, we see that it manifests again in a different situation, different people, different ideology, different practice, different path, spiritual path. But yes, there's that suffering again. There's my anger. There is my sadness. So the spirit of froglessness is to say, okay, I'm not going to let that frog drag me around after it anymore, because we have a frog inside of us. And we come here to Deer Park, and it's like we're the frog on the plate. And then when suffering comes, boom, we want to jump off. But what happens if we practice froglessness? So we don't let that frog bring us along and jump off the plate again, but we just stay here. Say, okay, I'm going to breathe with this, I'm going to hold this, I'm going to benefit from the collective energy of the Sangha, and see if I can understand the roots of this suffering. Thay said, mindfulness practice is the art of suffering. If we know how to suffer, we suffer less. So it doesn't mean we don't have any suffering, but we learn how to manage our suffering, to take care of it, not see it as a kind of horror show, or like the scary demon, but actually learn to sit down and have tea with our suffering. And so if you wake up in the morning and you feel a little bit down, difficult, then you can pour yourself a cup of tea and drink tea with your suffering. I do it. And it's very lovely. Say, hello, you are there. I know you are there. And I am benefiting from my brothers and sisters, my siblings on the path here at Deer Park. And I'm not going to run away from you anymore. Because I know that when I run away, you reappear somewhere else. And I will have to jump off the plate again in that other place, and again and again. And maybe I die, and those people who are my continuation, those living beings who receive my actions of body, speech, and mind, they will also do like I did and continue jumping. So they are my continuation. And we end up with a whole world, a whole society of people jumping off the plate every time there's a little bit of suffering. So one of the noblest things I feel a person can do is decide to not follow the frog anymore. And what helps is to recognize that the suffering is not just our own suffering, but it's ancestral suffering. There's a kind of trauma which is transmitted generation after generation. And it is not only through blood, but also through actions of body, speech, and mind of our ancestors, through our teachers, through our friends, through culture, media, advertisements, the internet. We are receiving in it from every direction these traumas that have not been healed. And Brother Phap Luu, the other day, he sent me a link, which is to a very beautiful talk by a man named Richard Rohr. Some of you may know, a Christian teacher. And he talked about the lack of initiation. What does it mean to be initiated? To go from childhood into adulthood. Almost every culture around the world has some kind of initiation, kind of rite, which marks the threshold between a childhood and an adult. And if we don't learn how to cross that threshold, if we don't learn how to face our suffering instead of run away from it, we are like a child running away our whole lives. So I really encourage everyone while you're here to use the collective energy, to make good use. You can borrow it to help you to look inside. And when things feel, you don't have to know why there's that pain. What's the nature of it? Why there's that irritation, that nausea, that unsettledness? But just look at it. Just make that commitment to shine the light on it and not do or say anything when that happens. That's the fourth mindfulness training, if you know the 5 mindfulness trainings. When we have anger, for example, coming up, we make the commitment not to say or do anything. It doesn't mean at all that we reject the anger. It doesn't mean that we cannot learn from that anger. So it's very consonant with an engaged practice. We work with many people in the climate movement, the Extinction Rebellion. Many activists who are dedicating their whole lives to address the climate crisis. And sometimes they ask, but if I don't act out of my anger, how can we change things? And what I learned myself when I was younger and I didn't have the practice yet, I had a lot of anger, and I went to many demonstrations. I lived in a squat for a while in Europe, in Paris. And then I was always cultivating anger towards society, towards capitalism, towards neoliberalism, whatever, And so I wanted to act to somehow change things. But I tried many things with different groups, and I saw it's very difficult to change when we have anger in our heart and not love. So I learned through the practice when I discovered it a few years later, and I was so overwhelmed with that anger that I could not even deal with myself and my own life. I learned to sit down and look at that anger. And so because I knew that there is also creativity in that anger. There is something I can learn. But when I quieted it down, I saw that a lot of that anger is not about the system or this or that outside of myself, but it had to do with what was going on inside of me. My parents' divorce, my immigrant ancestors and what they left behind in Europe, the pain and suffering, that which then manifested in, I'm sure, I don't know, but maybe in the household, in abuse, and in these things, and these things that which run through the family line to our ancestral lineage, they are then, if we don't embrace them and heal them, then we just go out into the world and we bring our conflict, our war out. Even if we think we are on the right side, we have the right ideology, but our words are in line with the people on the good side, the progressive, changing the world, but in our heart there is anger and fear and anxiety and jealousy. So this is why the monks and nuns in our tradition, we dedicate our lives to transformation and healing, because we see it as a kind of radical activism. And we make mistakes, and we are not perfect, and we learn to, but we have an open heart. We're willing to learn from the community, from our siblings, and every day the community is my main teacher. Whether I'm cooking or washing up or giving a Dhamma talk or digging a hole. It's really the teaching everywhere around. And it's the kind of community I want to live in. One that is helping me to grow and understand better my own mind in every moment. And so coming together for this Rains Retreat is in that spirit, is letting go of our ideas, our theories about practice, and getting down to the practice. And so that is also the topic of this talk today. So today is a bit of a kind of double whammy. So we've been going through the 40 tenets of Plum Village, which is core teachings, that core insights that our teacher had, our community had, about the Buddhist tradition. And these core insights are coming not from just sitting around thinking or philosophizing, but from lived community life. So lived practice in Plum Village. And Thai taught these 40 tenets in, I think, around 2006. And they haven't been published yet in English, but we hope in the next year or two they will we'll finally be able to put out that book. So we've been, some of the young brothers asked me sometime last year if I would teach these 40 tenets, because many of them hadn't had a chance to study directly with Thai, and because the teachings are in Vietnamese that are recorded. So that's what's been going on this past year. We've been slowly, when we have time on Wednesday night, going through the 40 tenets. So we've done 38 of them so far, and today we're going to see if we do 39 and 40 in one class. So that's they kind of go together. So, and then we'll see what we do in the winter Rains Retreat on Wednesday nights. Okay, so the 39th tenet. Conditions, feelings, skandhas, āyatanas, dhātus, vijñāna, etc., are different ways of presenting the teachings. These different ways of presentation are not in opposition to each other. So the main point of this tenet is that we should not get caught in lists and numbers of things. So when you get to the early layer of the Buddhist teachings, actually it's mostly taught in verse. And those early verses in the text like the Sutta Nipata, which is, as far as we can determine, a very ancient early layer of the Buddhist teachings, it's likely those verses are in verse form because it was easier to remember, because each line has a certain meter, and so you could commit it to memory very easily. And one of the ways that Buddhist teaching could be remembered as other than meter was also by lists of numbers. Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path, 3 kinds of feelings, 6 āyatanas, 18 dhātus, 6 consciousnesses, 5 skandhas. There's 4 conditions, 9 conditions in some traditions, 10 conditions, 12 conditions, 24 conditions. And so it seems, now here in the modern times we have this great benefit of being able to look at the whole of the Buddhist corpus that we have passed down to us, whether it's from the southern transmission, from the Pali Canon mainly, but mainly from the Pali Canon, whether it's the agamas in the East Asian tradition, as well as the Mahayana Sutras and Vinayas and so forth that have been translated into Chinese, or whether it's the Tibetan Canyon, which was transmitted from a little bit later from India up to Tibet. And we have fragments of other things that are found in archaeological digs, like there's a bunch of birch bark scrolls found in Gandhara about, 20, 30 years ago. And they were sealed very well, and so they slowly, Richard Salomon up in University of Washington, slowly they would roll them out so they could piece together the texts that are on these birch bark scrolls. So anyway, that we have access to all of these now, and so we can look and see that there's incredible similarities to be found in all of these different texts. And though the traditions look very different on the outside, if we look deeply, we can see a common thread of teachings. And so we should not get caught in whether it's 8 of this or 5 of this or whatever, but we look at the Buddhist teachings as skillful means to help us to wake up. And this ties in with what we're going to go into in the 40th tenet, which is about not having a dogmatic view. So that is the main topic of today's talk. How can we, as Buddhists, free ourselves from our own attachment to Buddhist teachings? Because if we are too attached to the Buddhist teachings, then we lose right view, right? Because right view is the capacity to let go of all views. It means to see what's going on in the present moment without having the rose-colored glasses of our perceptions get in the way. So every moment is, we are noticing what ways we are grasping onto something inside, holding onto that to be the absolute truth. And that grasping energy is actually, it can make our body become, lose its health, become anxious, worried, fearful. We fear that somebody will come and try to take away our belief. Whenever we hold on to any view, then we are afraid and we want to avoid the people who contradict or say something different from what we think or believe. And so in the Buddhist teachings, we have been unskillful at times, in that we become, in our spirit of wanting to free and help people to wake up, we become also caught in our belief. And we become very kind of closed and dogmatic, and we just want to have people memorize lists of this and that, and then if they do that, then they're a good Buddhist, and then we can make them offerings, and then we feel we can get a better life in the next lifetime, or whatever, And that's a very kind of narrow and dogmatic view of the Buddhist tradition, which is about the spirit of openness, inclusiveness, of learning, of being able to look and see what is happening in the world, in science, in the empirical lived experience of reality, and then be able to learn and grow from that. And if we look deeply into the Four Noble Truths, we see that as the spirit of the teachings. This is suffering. It means we look at it directly. We don't just repeat like a robot, this is suffering. This is the ending of, this is the cause of suffering, the ending of suffering, the path. We could just keep repeating that all day long, but we don't suffer any less if we don't actually look deeply into our suffering. So the reason we focus in our centers on the practice of mindfulness is that we want to be able to embrace our suffering with mindfulness, to understand its nature, so that we can grow and transform. Not just to get up and repeat this list or that list of Buddhism and then have a nice meal and then go back to our room. So we help each other as practitioners. Yeah? We benefit from the teaching, so we don't reject it. We want to learn and have these teachings go in deeply, but it's not enough just to learn them. We have to put them into practice and see for ourselves whether those are really beneficial. And sometimes it takes time. Yeah, it takes time, and I've been a monk for 19 years, and I still suffer. But I have a lot of happiness. And so when I look back at the young man who suffered so much and started meditating, 23 or 4 years ago, I see a much happier person, a much lighter person. much less angry person. But it doesn't mean I don't suffer. And I still practice to embrace my suffering with mindfulness. So all these things that I share about borrowing the energy of the community, loving the practice. I cultivate a love and a joy for the practice. I don't think, oh, there's a Dhamma talk or Dhamma sharing. I don't want to go to Dhamma sharing. I just want to lay in my room and play Wordle on my phone. I don't know. I don't know what people do. It's always something we can do to distract ourselves. But everything you'll see that's done in the monastery is there to help you to kind of strengthen the seed of mindfulness so that it's easier for you in a difficult moment to shine the light of mindfulness on your suffering. Because that's where the real learning takes place. It's not through sutras or chanting or making offerings, although those things can benefit us. But the real learning is just like the Buddha did. He sat under the Bodhi tree and he said, okay, I'm not going to be a frog anymore. I'm not going to move. I've learned all these teachings because he learned from different masters at that time in India. He practiced on his own extreme asceticism, not eating, even not holding his breath for a long time. But he saw that he hadn't discovered the root cause of his suffering. So he decided, okay, I'm not going to jump around like a frog anymore. I'm going to sit under this tree. And that's the spirit of the winter retreat. It's okay, boom. I sit here and I'm with brothers and sisters and I'm going to practice. And if we have that aspiration, and we just show up, because for me, 95% of the practice is just showing up. Right? Just showing up for the activities, showing up for our brothers and sisters, our siblings, practicing together, and mainly just showing up for ourselves. Because if we don't show up for ourselves, who we show up for? So for me, showing up for an activity is the same kind of action as showing up for those brothers and sisters I live with. It's also showing up for myself. So if you have difficulty really sitting with suffering, then just come to sitting meditation. Just come to eat with the Sangha. Practice wholeheartedly eating with the Sangha. Treat the dining hall like a meditation hall. That is the spirit of Plum Village practice. Every activity is there for us to make good use of it. So whether you use it or not is up to you. Like, we provide the conditions, but it's up to you. We can listen to the sound of the bell. In 2011, a group of young monks and nuns, we went on a wake-up tour in the northeast of the US to many colleges and universities. And at the end of that tour, we had a day of mindfulness in downtown New York. And as part of that day of mindfulness, we went to Union Square and we did a flash mob sitting meditation. So we didn't have a permit to do an activity. And so we learned that you couldn't have groups of more than like 20 or 25 people. If you had that, then you needed to have a permit. So we divided up into groups. We had 100 young people, so we made like 4 or 5 groups of 20 people. And we just happened to come together in the same place and sit down at the same time. And there was a man who was preaching there in the square. And so, I don't know why he just came to my mind, but so we sat for half an hour there. And during that whole time, the man was preaching. And so we got to, it's like a guided meditation while we were doing sitting meditation. And I always remember he said, "The Buddha cannot save you. Muhammad cannot save you." All the, he listed off. There was one person who could save you. But, but I always said, "Yes, you're right, the Buddha cannot save you." And I think he said, "But you cannot save yourself." And I said, "Well, I'm not sure about that." But I always remember when I share, like, the monastery, we provide conditions, but ultimately it's up to you. The Buddha creates conditions. He teaches the Dhamma using various teachings, like talking about different kinds of causes and conditions. Usually you hear about 3 feelings, but sometimes in Plum Village we talk about 4 feelings. There's a sutra where this Thai talks about in giving this teaching on the 39th tenet about 2 practitioners, and one of them said, "The Buddha talked about 3 feelings," and the other said, "No, he talked about 5 feelings." And the other said, "No, 3 feelings, 5 feelings," and they get in a big argument. And so then they go to the Buddha and he says, "Why are you arguing about you can say there are 3 feelings, you can say there are 5 feelings, you can say there are 20 feelings, there are 40 feelings. But the point is not to argue about how many feelings there are. The point is to be able to look at our, for example, pleasant feelings, or painful feelings, neutral feelings, or mix thereof, and be able to see them directly, understand their nature, understand how they arise due to causes and conditions. It's not for the point of arguing whether there's 3 or 5 or whatever. Then we miss the point entirely. So we come back to this teaching on the raft, right? In the sutra on the better way to catch a snake, one of the early sutras. It's in the Chinese agamas as well as the Pali Canon. The Buddha used a teaching where he said the Dhamma is like a raft. Right? So a man comes to the shore and he cannot cross the river, so he sees some branches, some reeds, and he makes a raft in order to cross the river. And then he thinks, "Wow, this raft is really useful. What if I pick it up and carry it with me, so if I meet another river, I'll be able to cross it?" And the Buddha asked the monks, "Would that be very intelligent of that man?" And the monk said, "No, world honored one. Because when he gets to the next river, there'll be other reeds and branches, and he can make another raft. It would be quite silly for him to carry that raft along with him." And he said, "The same is true of the Dhamma I teach. You should let go of that Dhamma when you cross to the other shore. How much more so other teachings?" So, well, he didn't say other teachings, he said how much more so adharma. It means things that are not leading to the Dhamma. So that is the spirit of Buddhism, is non-dogmatic. So as Buddhist practitioners, as Buddhist teachers, we use all of these teachings. They're really metaphors. And science also uses metaphors. I tell you, I can talk about a photon or electron or a proton. But do you really know what a proton is? I mean, you become familiarized with the word. You can imagine some pictures, some images that were drawn for you in a science book, but do you really know what a proton is? Right? These are even science and words are just metaphors to help us understand the nature of reality. But if we don't take the next step, which is to experience it directly ourselves, then we are not a true scientist, and we are not a true practitioner. So if we get caught in the idea that, these things are fixed and absolute, there are 6 āyatanas. Āyatanas are the sense spheres. So like the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And the dhātus is a way of, it includes the āyatanas, so the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. It includes the objects of eye, so like form, or sound, smell, taste, touch, and objects of mind. And the vijñāna consciousness is the consciousness that arises due when eye comes in contact with form. So, for example, when you look at the orchid, so there are photons that are bouncing off the surface of the flower, and because every of the visual wavelength, every color is being absorbed except the purple ones are being reflected, so we experience purple in our eye. So that gives rise to consciousness. So the contact between the eye and the object, the form, when they come together, it leads to eye consciousness. And the same is true of ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue, and so forth. So in total you have 6 āyatanas, 6 objects, and we have 6 consciousnesses that arise. So in total the dhātus are 18. And in traditional Buddhist teaching, that means that the whole world can be put into these 18 dhātus. So when we talk about the 18 dhātus, it means the entire experienced reality. I and form and so forth. But, for example, we now know there are other senses as well, like a sense of balance. There's, I think it's called the vestibular canal, that in our ear, which keeps us balanced. So I can stand here and not fall over. If I didn't have that sense, then I wouldn't be standing in front of you. So in all of us, even if we're seated, we have a sense of balance. But you cannot say it's eye or ear or nose. I mean ear in sense of hearing, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, right? It's something somehow other. So then we need to add another one. And then we have also the object of balance, which we could say is maybe the pull of gravity, right? And then vijñāna is the consciousness, balance, consciousness. So then now we have 18, 19, 20, 21 dhātus. And then we can talk about proprioception, like the sense of the body in space. It could be another sense. Anyway, we could go on and look at different kinds of senses. But if we understand that the Buddhist teaching is for the purpose of releasing our grasping from sense objects, then we know that most of us were not very attached to our sense of balance. Like it's hard to grasp onto a sense of balance. I mean, I haven't been in outer space, in weightlessness, but maybe you feel. I have tried the virtual reality goggles. A few years ago, I was at Lascaux, which is a very famous cave near Plum village in France, where there are ancient paintings from, I think, about 30,000 years ago, cave paintings. And they made a replica of it because you can't go in the old one because it's deteriorating from the contact with human breath. And then they made a replica of the replica because the replica was getting like too many visitors. And then so I went to the replica of the replica, And then on top of that, they made a virtual reality experience of going in the cave. So it's like, well, I guess the virtual reality was a replica of the original, so I shouldn't say it's a replica of a replica of a replica. So I was standing there in the replica of the replica with these goggles on in virtual reality, and I felt a little bit attached to my sense of balance because I felt very nauseous going around this cave, with these virtual reality goggles. And they made it into like a game, and you had to find like little treasures in different places in the cave. I think it's for kids, but anyway, I was going around with the virtual reality goggles, like trying to get these little coins or something, like in Super Mario Brothers or something, like in the cave. And after just a few minutes, I felt so nauseous. Has anyone else had that experience? So I thought maybe I have some grasping towards my sense of balance, because my eye consciousness was giving me very different data than my vestibular canal. And so suddenly that cognitive dissonance was causing like real illness in my body. I felt like it took me half an hour to get over it. It was really unpleasant. So, but most of us are not very attached to our sense of balance. And we're not suffering because of our sense of balance. So if we see the Buddhist teachings not as describing or trying to like map reality, but rather as a path, always in the context of a path. It's a path. These teachings are there to help us on the path of the cessation of suffering, the path of happiness. Then we see that, yes, we get attached to forms that we see with the eye. Yes, we get attached to sounds that we hear with the ear. We get attached to smells and so forth. And then we become, by being aware of that, then we can let go of it and suffer less. So we know, like we see the brownie on the table and we smile. We don't need to just start moving towards the brownie and picking it up, but we can learn just to like enjoy the brownie on the table and not have to. So that's the kind of practice that we do. It doesn't mean we can't eat brownies in the monastery, but it means that we're not carried away by our senses, what we see with our eye and ear, nose, tongue, so forth. So that is the spirit of the teachings, and we can always learn new things. So the spirit of Buddhism should be open and inclusive. So we don't see that, if as Buddhist teachers and practitioners we get caught in arguing, with that monk or that teacher in a different tradition, say, no, it's 6 of this and 7 of that and 8 of that. It's such a waste of time. What's important is that people are becoming more free, letting go of their attachments, letting go of their points of view. So whatever way that we can learn to do that, we can use that. So the 5 skandhas are for that purpose. But we can talk about 2 skandhas. Like the Buddha talked about nama rupa. So there's form, rupa, like the body, and there's nama, which includes feelings, perceptions, mental formation, consciousness. So that could be like 2 skandhas. But then you say, no, there are 5 skandhas. That's a different category. Nama rupa is something else. But okay, fine. But the spirit in the Plum Village tradition is not to get caught in disputes about these kind of things, because what we want most deeply is to help ourselves and others to transform and heal. So we make good use of the experience of the spiritual lineage and the teachings, and we have the spirit of tolerance and inclusiveness, so we can learn not only from other Buddhist traditions, but also from other spiritual traditions, and also from science. So this is the spirit of this 39th teaching, 39th tenet.
even later on in the Mahayana, we developed, ancestral teachers developed teachings like talking about the seventh consciousness, manas, which is the quality of grasping of the mind, or the eighth consciousness, the store consciousness, where the seeds of all the potentialities of all of our mental formations are when they're not yet manifesting in mind consciousness. And even there are some traditions that talk about a ninth consciousness, kind of vimala vijñāna, which is like purified consciousness, which is the when our mind has been completely free from any attachment, we attain the ninth consciousness, like a kind of attainment. But again, these are just skillful means to help us understand our mind. Because in some areas, the monks became very dogmatic about this. There are only 6 consciousnesses. And when you add another one, I cannot talk with you. You are not a Buddhist anymore. So if you add a 10th consciousness, 11th consciousness, and then some people will walk away with you, this is a blasphemy. But if it's helping people to understand their mind and to grow, we can see this. It's a very intolerant and dogmatic point of view. So don't get caught too much in the list of things. But we learn it. We learn it in the spirit of openness so we can get insight. I myself have gotten a lot of insight from the Buddhist tradition, and I continue to learn. That's why I'm a monk. That's why I love to learn the Dhamma and teach the Dhamma. But I keep my heart open. And this is something I had to learn, because when I first learned the Buddhist teaching, I wanted to learn everything. And I buried myself in the library for many years, so to read everything about Buddhism I could. But I learned from Tai, my teacher, that if I'm not careful, I can become dogmatic about the teachings and close, and then my own growth becomes stuck as a practitioner. So we benefit from the teachings, we learn from it, but we do not become dogmatic. And this leads very well into the 40th tenet. Here you can listen to the sound of the bell. The teachings on impermanence non-self, interdependence, emptiness, signlessness, aimlessness, mindfulness, concentration and insight. And other related teachings. Constitute the heart of Buddhist wisdom. They can go together with the spirit of science. They can be used in dialogue between Buddhist practitioners and scientists. I'm going to run out of space. Between Buddhist practitioners and scientists. And they can offer suggestions and be a support for scientific research. I'm going to go up here. Modern science can overcome the tendency of double grasping. And scientists can train their intuitive intuitive capacity. So when we look at the Buddhist teachings, we can see the whole Chinese canon, for example, on a bookshelf, and it takes up many, many shelves. Or the Pali canon, or the Tibetan canon. When there's a Tibetan center that's nearby Plum Village, and we sometimes went to visit them, and they have a library, and so you go down and you see, shelf after shelf after shelf. Of course, there are also commentaries and so forth. But so we need to, as practitioners, be intelligent and see what is the heart of the Buddhist teachings, and not get caught in what is just expedient or superficial means. So this is the spirit of this tenet. So we focus on, for example, impermanence, noting that nothing is permanent, nothing we think, say, or do, not our body, not our feelings, not our perceptions. Everything is flowing and changing all the time. And so, and to what extent that we try to think that there's something that is permanent, to that extent we suffer. And so as living beings in the midst of a flow of impermanent feelings, perceptions, mental formations, we practice letting go and learning how to just be with what is, to be, what we say, to dwell happily in the present moment, even in the midst of all this impermanence. And that's somewhat counterintuitive. But as we begin to practice, as we practice sitting meditation, walking meditation, and we see our feelings coming and going, we see that if we're able to just let them come and go, just like riding the waves, that we actually discover incredible stability in the midst of impermanence, the stability of a Buddha. So that is the spirit of the teachings on impermanence. We don't get caught in this body, these feelings, these perceptions. So when we have a pleasant emotion, we can be aware of it, enjoy it, but we don't hold on to it. We know it's not possible to hold on to it because it's changing. And there's non-self. So the thing we most want to hold on to and keep as permanent is our idea of ourself. Or that there is a self that is passed on from one body to the next. Or that there's some kind of permanent entity that is somehow beyond the flesh body. And we want to, though everything in this flesh body is impermanent, but that self is permanent. It's my stability. And so even that, we have to let go of. Because when we look deeply, and science also corroborates this, we cannot find anywhere that permanent thing. And when we look deeply into even the idea of some permanent entity, we see that how could this entity interact with anything in the world? As soon as it interacts, it is no longer permanent. Right? So if that permanent entity is somehow influencing this body, these feelings, perceptions, then it is no longer permanent. It is impermanent. You see? Because it is interacting. And that means it's changing. So when we look deeply into our concepts about ourselves and about our beliefs, our notions, we have to see that those are also impermanent. They are the product of the accumulation of our pleasant feelings very often, and our wish to get away from negative feelings. But those are also impermanent. So we let go of even our idea of ourself. And as we learned already, impermanence can be thought of as the aspect of time, that there is no absolute time, nothing eternal, and non-self can be looking from this point of view of space. So they're really describing the same thing with two different ways of looking. Right? One is from the aspect of time, and one is from the aspect of space. But we know from what we've learned from Mr. Einstein that time and space are one fabric. So it's just different ways of approaching the same grasping. Interdependence. Everything inter-is with everything else. The flower is only made of non-flower elements, like the sun, the rain, the earth, the air, the CO2 in the air. When you look at a tree, you think, oh, that tree grew up from the earth, but it's more appropriate to say that tree grew from the air, because the tree is made up of the CO2 from the air, as well as some nutrients from the soil and water and so forth. So we see that everything can be looked at and with those eyes of interdependence, that we ourselves are also made up of non-us elements. And that is also separate from the teaching on emptiness. Emptiness means that nothing can be by itself alone. Emptiness is actually fullness. It means when we say interdependence, it's from the point of view that everything is interconnected. But emptiness helps us to free ourselves from the idea that there is some kind of entity, a separate self, which is somehow not interdependent. So they are actually saying the same thing from a different point of view. Signlessness helps us become free from our attachment to words. Like the words on this board. Our concepts and notions. So we don't get caught or deceived anymore and think that there's something tasty, savory, pleasant that we can get behind that sign. I was thinking when I wrote these words on the board, I said, oh, it's very nice to talk about impermanence and non-self, interdependence. I was feeling very happy writing this on the board. And I said, but I can get caught in the sign and just be saying, just repeating interdependence, emptiness, signlessness, but not touching the insight of impermanence, the insight of non-self. So that is, if I stand up here and give a Dhamma talk, or you stand up here, it's the same. I was just talking with my brother, Brother Peace, because we're roommates now. I was just talking about, I just like practicing the Dhamma, listening to the Dhamma, whether I'm teaching it, whether I'm listening to it, I'm happy because it's helping me to be free. And that is the spirit of the practice. And so whether somebody says it in Spanish, whether talks about it in Sanskrit or Chinese or Vietnamese, the essence is empty, signless, aimless. Aimlessness is another very tasty practice. It means, we notice how we tend to go to the same things for sustenance. It's kind of like the blue jays, the scrub jays here, and they taking nuts and they're packing them away all over the place, and they remember where they put their little stash. And so we are a little bit like that. We have little stashes of joy everywhere. And so what happens if we let go? We don't go after our little stash of joy. And just be with our breathing. Notice our tendency to want to go there. And we can go somewhere else. Be somewhere else. Say something else. Do something else. We don't have to be dragged along by our habit And then, like we have on the three, on the stained glass window here, there's 3 fundamental trainings: mindfulness, concentration, and insight. So we've touched on all of these earlier on in the 40 Tenets. So all these teachings are the heart of the Buddhist teaching, the heart of the Buddhist wisdom. And of course, when we come in contact with the Buddhist teachings, we will learn about things like the pure land of the Buddha, of Amitabha Buddha, that if you recite the Namo Ayida Phat or whatever, Namo Ame Tofu, or whatever, over and over, that you'll be reborn in the pure land where you can hear the Dhamma all the time, like it's like constantly running on a YouTube channel, live stream. Actually, you can do that now. Maybe we're living in the Pure Land. So, teachings like, at some point, there are whole factions of Buddhists arguing about whether there can only be one Buddha at a given time in a given universe, or whether there can be more than one Buddha. And the monks were arguing about this. Like, really, like, emotionally arguing about whether there can be one Buddha or many Buddhas. So, Thay wants us to point us to the heart of the Buddhist teaching, not to try to, belittle, right? So what I learned from Thay, so important, because those of us who have a European background, we have, especially if we have Christian roots, we have this kind of trauma of the kind of ideological warfare that has been transmitted to us. And I was very aware of it living for 11 years in France. I didn't realize, I grew up thinking, World War I, World War II, these were like horrible wars, and of course they were, but I didn't anticipate this kind of deep trauma that was happening in the Reformation times, when, just over the mountain, there's some prince who decided that suddenly everyone's going to be this faith, and then everybody had to abandon what they believed like a year ago, and then suddenly profess this other thing, and then kill anybody who had the other belief. And how traumatic that is. And so this seed of dogmatism is like deeply rooted in European culture, somehow, of like adhering to a belief system and then actually like killing people because they profess some other belief. And this is very strange. I mean, it's so painful. Your own brother, maybe, because of an ideology. And so we have to recognize that that trauma is inside of us. And one of the most important things I learned from my teacher was this attitude of tolerance. Not to belittle or argue or try to any aspect of Buddhist teaching, let alone other spiritual traditions, right? Because if people are benefiting, they're getting happiness, then we have to meet them where they're at. But as practitioners, we want to go deep. We're not satisfied with just the superficial teachings. And I gave a class already talking about rebirth with that respect. And whether we just look at the superficial level, we're very familiar with what we consider like superficial teachings on rebirth in the Buddhist tradition. It's usually it's hardly any retreat where somebody doesn't ask us a question about it. But we want to go deeper. We want to see the process of birth and death happening in every moment, in the present moment, and not just get attached to a kind of superficial idea of, reincarnation or whatever, right? So this is the spirit of science. And Thay distinguishes about spirit of science and scientific discoveries. So when we make a discovery, a new insight, and it seems to disrupt everything in science, we run the danger of becoming attached to that discovery as scientists. And we think that discovery is now explains everything. And we become dogmatic. And we become closed, and we lose our openness and creativity. We lose our insight. So this is where Thai feels that Buddhism can help science. Let go of grasping. So when we get a deep insight, we just smile and we get some joy, but we don't get attached to that insight. Because as scientists, we want to become famous, we want to tell the world about our discovery, we want everyone to look at me when you think about that discovery. And then we get caught. And when new insights come, that question our hypothesis, our what we proved irrefutable, beyond dispute, our heart is closed, our ears are closed, and we cannot listen, we cannot learn anymore, because we think we know everything about that discovery. So whether we are Buddhist practitioners or scientists, we have to keep this heart of openness, to know that our perceptions are not infallible, and that we have very, very limited bandwidth to experience this world. And so that gives us, it helps us to cultivate patience, cultivate tolerance, cultivate inclusivity. Thai had the calligraphy, "Are you sure?" And so we can remind ourselves every day, I practice that, am I sure? Especially when I feel really sure. That's the moment. Like if I'm not so sure, are you sure? No, I'm not really sure. But when you're really sure, that's the moment you need to see that calligraphy. Are you sure? You check your perceptions, and you see that your perceptions can be quite limited. And we can make a lot of pain and suffering based on those wrong perceptions. And that has happened as well in science. So we don't get caught by the scientific discovery, but we keep the spirit of science, which is openness, inclusiveness, curiosity, intuition. Why don't I try this? Let's try this. It's fun. We're learning. We're Homo sapiens. We have this body. We have this curiosity. We want to learn. But we don't want that learning to close us. So even as scientists, we may be reliving the Reformation. When we have our discovery, we suddenly create a new field and we say, they are wrong. We point the finger, those idiots. And we don't invite them to any more conferences. They can't have coffee and donuts anymore at our conference. They are now excommunicated. We're laughing, but this is what happens. Right? So we need to have that spirit of openness. So it doesn't mean we are not rigorous. It doesn't mean that we have to practice also froglessness to really look and see what's there. We can't just make things up. Right? So it's not to say that there's nothing true, but we have to keep openness. So we get insight, we keep it open. We don't let it become calcified inside our mind. And these teachings can be used to help dialogue between Buddhist practitioners and scientists. So we just had a science retreat called the Buddha the Scientist here at Deer Park. And we had our first symposium right here. And I think 5 or 6 scientists presented. Some had done research on mindfulness of eating, and the effect of mindfulness practice on the eating habits of children. Some had been working in psychotherapy and shared about what had been learned about trauma in the body and how mindfulness can help us to heal this trauma. And one scientist shared about the effects of mindfulness practice on medical practitioners, doctors, nurses, surgeons, so forth. Benefits that they had had. And also on mindful eating and nutrition. So anyway, this was just a seed of this kind of spirit of having dialogue. And I know as well in Plum Village that the monks and nuns there are also doing this kind of retreats. So this is the task that Thai gave to us, to have these kind of dialogues. And I remember when in 2006, I was with one other brother, and we were organizing I think the first science retreat, the neuroscience retreat, that took place in 2006. That's you can read in the book, The Buddha Body, Buddha Mind, and Thai's teaching from that retreat. And we went to visit Thai in the Hermitage, and we had a list of scientists we wanted to invite. And I remember Thai was very patient. And we wanted, we had all these questions, like we were concerned, do they have to pay for the retreat? Can we invite them? Or can, because we know that those scientists, usually they get invited to a conference and then somebody pays for their plane ticket and things like that. And we're like, we're monks and nuns, we can't really do that. And Thai said, Thai doesn't want, the main thing Thai told us was that Thai doesn't want those scientists to just come and read their papers that they already wrote. They can come, but they come to practice. And after they practice for a few days, with the Sangha, with the collective energy of the Sangha, and they go in themselves, they can share about their experience of practicing as scientists. And so that was the spirit of the Buddha, the scientist retreat. The scientists came, they practiced with us. And so their sharing has a very different quality. The symposium was after 5 days of practice. Nina was one of our scientists. And it was so wonderful to hear the energy. I enjoyed it was like eating a big bowl of fruit when you're really thirsty and hungry. Because we finished the retreat and then we got to just enjoy and hear these wonderful, caring, loving, and deeply committed scientists sharing about the fruits of their practice. And the spirit and the energy of the Dhamma is there, even if it's talking about research and evidence and all these things, because they're glowing from their own practice in the retreat. And so that is the spirit of this. They are practicing these teachings, and then when they share, there is an openness, and we can learn from each other. One group, they went back and they were just so excited. They have, there's so many possibilities of things we can research. They had so much insight from the retreat because it was their first time on retreat. So that is how the practice in this dialogue can be a support, offer suggestions and support for scientific research. And we also learned about the double grasping and this dichotomy, which seems to be fundamental in science, between the observer and the observed. We've started to see break down. For example, with quantum physics, learning that when we know the position of a particle, then we cannot know its necessarily other qualities, like the velocity. So our act of measuring is somehow affecting, the act of observing is affecting what is being observed. And that has been also applied to other areas of science, where we look back on research that has been done perhaps decades before and continues sometimes to go on now, where the biases of the researchers have been heavily influencing the results. And the way of asking the question, it means the observer is actually changing the subject that it's observed. And so that is what we call double grasping. It's where we separate observer and observed. And so the spirit of learning how to let go of that kind of grasping, because we do it, because we have, as we learn, I has form, gives rise to I consciousness. So we think these things that I'm seeing, that is me. These things that I'm hearing, that is me, is myself. And we grasp on. But actually, when there's a moment of consciousness, there just arises the subject and object of consciousness. I, form. And that is just in an instant, and then it dissolves. There's nothing permanent. But because we grasp onto this idea of I am the subject, and everything I experience outside and inside are the observed, and we separate the two, and we believe that they are two separate things. That is what is double grasping, and that is a pitfall for scientists. It gives rise to research which has all kinds of errors, which gives all kinds of wrong insights. And we can have whole areas of science go off on a tangent for many years and decades because people in certain positions are blaming and judging other people. And we have to go along with the consensus because it's too scary to be a heretic. And so things like insights, beautiful insights that have come, like the insight that our mitochondria very likely came from a separate cell, which then was embedded in another cell, giving rise to eukaryotic cells, what we know as animal and plant life. For many years, the mainstream could not accept that idea. It was like a heresy that another cell could get into another cell. That the mitochondria that generates the energy in every cell in our body could have been a separate cell on its own. But now it's very accepted. So this is a kind of lurching of science as it goes through time. And the grasping is what creates the suffering, because when we hold too tightly to our belief and we're not willing to be open to new evidence, then we blame and judge and argue our way and terrorize other scientists. So the spirit in the monastery is one of tolerance and inclusivity. We are open. We don't have to be forced to accept others' views, but we have an openness, a patience, a kindness. Otherwise, we might see that grasping energy is still there, and there's somewhere inside of us which is stuck. And instead of seeing that stuckness as an opportunity to grow, to heal and transform, we just keep holding on to it with more determination. And we make ourselves suffer and we make others suffer. So this is the path that Thai presents to us going forward. A dialogue between Buddhism and science. So Buddhism can also learn and improve our ways of teaching and learning the Dhamma. So thank you. I know it's a little bit long today, but we finished the 40 tenets after more than a year, I think. So it's wonderful. We can hopefully, I heard that there are many sanghas that are going through these teachings, and I hope that those sanghas, when the book is published, maybe in a year or two, that we have a chance to go deeper into it, because I was not able to present everything that's in the book. So I'm sure but I tried to do my best to just give the essence of what's I felt is the most important. So it's a wonderful thing that we can continue to share and learn from. So thank you for your support. We'll finish with 3 sounds of the bell.